So this is part 2 of Kantian Deontology. Part 1 dealt with the general structure of Kantian Deontology and the first formulation of the categorical imperative. This deals with the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Now, these often have different names, these formulations, depending on how people have parsed them out and what their main point is over the centuries. Remember, a nickname for the first formulation was the formula of universal law. I provided that not because you have to know that, but because it helps some people to understand what the basic elements are. Similarly, the second formulation of the categorical imperative has 2 nicknames. It's also known as the formula of humanity and the principle of respect for persons. Again, I provide these only as a help to you, not because you have to memorize them. So to see what this is, we're going to look in Vaughan on page 38 in the right-hand column. So pause this while you find it. All right. So you're looking at the second paragraph, right-hand column, page 38. Vaughan says, perhaps the most renowned formulation of the categorical imperative is the principle of respect for persons. A formulation distinct from the first one, though Kant thought them equivalent. As he puts it, quote, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Okay, now this is kind of great. It's derived from how valuable reason is to morality. Kant once said, if there was no rational creature or being anywhere in the universe, there would be no morality. But as long as you have one to generate the moral law through reflection, through using the categorical imperative, then you have morality. And it is because of that that we must respect all rational beings so intensely. All right? So act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. This can get a little tricky. All right? The reason it can get a little tricky is because we can get hung up on the words means and end. But you're already familiar with a phrase that captures how this works, a means to an end. If you use something as a means to an end, you use it as a tool, right? But if you use something merely as a means to an end or simply as a means to an end, you treat it as nothing but a tool. So let's look at a useful restatement of this. Act in such a way that you always treat persons, whether yourself or another, never merely as a means, but always at the same time as having intrinsic value. Something of value in and of themselves that can't just be reduced to a tool. Right? So I can never use somebody merely as a means to an end. Now look, I underlined this, and you should underline simply as a means, which is in the original version of the text, in your own notes. Right? That's because this doesn't prohibit using someone as a means to an end. It prohibits using them merely as a means to an end. Right now, you are using me as a means to an end of doing well in this course, right? I'm trying to help you do that by recording these lectures, sharing my knowledge with you. I'm going to be doing that with feedback on papers and discussion forums and so forth. But you're not using me merely as a means to an end because you're respecting me. I have a friend who was treated merely as a means to an end by one of her students. The student showed up at her apartment. God knows how he got her address. Showed up at her apartment at midnight, the night before a paper was due, and said, Dr. X, I can't figure this out. I need help. And she said, I'm sorry, I had office hours earlier today. I helped you guys online if you came in for help. I already made myself available to you. You cannot come to my home and demand that I help you. And the student was so distressed that when she tried to close the door, he put his foot in the door. Right? He was clearly treating her as merely a means to his end. Yet he hadn't taken the responsibility. And in the circumstances where she had made herself available for his use to succeed, he had not come to those. Now he was expecting her to make room in her life at midnight in her own personal space for him. He did not respect her, This is why this is sometimes called the formula of respect for persons. He was treating her merely as a means. So you're allowed to treat someone as a means, but not merely as a means. You must respect them. All right, well, let's consider a medical application of this. One of the most common medical applications of this is human experiments, and Vaughan mentions this at the bottom of page 38 in the right-hand column. Right? So when you use people as human subjects, as human participants in research, you are using them as a means to the end of testing the safety and efficacy of a drug for other patients, not even for that patient. This may have no benefit at all to the patient, and patients are supposed to know that when they sign up. They're supposed to be free to refuse. And yet in our country, there's a history of lying to patients to keep them in studies. There's a history of using prisoners or the poor and then offering them incentives like early release or money in exchange for their participation in ways that are really coercive, where you're trying to put them into a situation where they cannot really say no. Those are the nice versions of experimenting on prisoners and the poor. There are also very clear examples of experiments being done on slaves during slavery in the United States and being done up through the 20th century on prisoners in prisons, people who cannot escape the control of those who are doing the experiments on them. Similarly, the U.S. Army famously experimented with mustard gas on soldiers who were not aware that they were being exposed to mustard gas, and experimented on soldiers by sending them into blast areas after nuclear tests without adequate information. And those soldiers, being in the military, had no real avenue for refusing to participate in the experiments. In those kinds of cases, the second formulation of the categorical imperative was being violated. Treating people in those ways treats them as merely a means to an end. And you also cannot universalize doing that. So that's why it is always imperative that we involve people in experiments only with their knowledge, with their consent, when they can meaningfully refuse to participate as well. So another point, I bet you think that when he says persons or humanity, he means you. I certainly did the first time I read this. And it wasn't until later on when I got really deep into some of Kant's larger work that I understood that unfortunately, he did not mean me. Because Kant believed that European males were very rational. He was writing in the 1800s, right? So this is a guy who believes that European males, writing mostly in the late 1700s into the 1800s, believes that European males are very rational. All his information about other kinds of people he had got from a very limited source. This is all in his book called Anthropology. Right? Most of his information about other peoples and other places was not from his own travel or not from careful, reliable scientists traveling to other places, but from very biased ship captains and ship workers who would put into port in Heidelberg, where Kant had a university position, and he would go down and he would interview them about other peoples. And it should come as no surprise that those ship workers, the captains and the sailors, would say really terribly racist things about people in Africa, people in Asia, people in the Americas, and so forth. So he came to the conclusion that European males were capable of the kind of rationality needed for doing the moral law, but he had reservations about all non-human animals and about many humans, dark-skinned folks of both sexes, and even European white women. He had doubts about. In another piece where Kant reflects on education, he says that women are fit to educate people in how to be moral, but are themselves not reliably capable of calculating the moral law using the categorical imperative. This is some pretty crappy stuff, I think you've got to admit. But we have to ask, was Kant's whole theory screwed up because of this? Should we throw it all out? I don't know. I think maybe this doesn't make the rest of his theory bad. I think what it should do is make us extremely careful of how we decide who counts. Do criminals count? Do children count? Humans with cognitive disabilities? Do non-human animals count? We should be extremely careful of how we draw the lines beyond which we say, we don't have moral duties to this kind of human. We don't have moral duties to this kind of non-human animal. Right. So I would take this with a grain of thought, but I want to acknowledge this sort of dark side of Kant because it can also help us to remain more careful about how we draw our own lines on deciding who can be killed, who cannot be killed, who can be denied medical treatment, who must not be denied medical treatment, and so forth. All right, this ends our discussion of the second formulation of the categorical imperative. We will, of course, have more chances to explore this in the discussion forums and on the reading quiz.